It was one of those bright December afternoons in St. Mary Mead, when the air carried that peculiar crispness that made the cheeks pink and the teapots steam twice as vigorously. The holly trees in Mrs. Weatherby's garden stood radiant and full, their glossy green leaves shining under the pale winter sun, berries glinting like drops of crimson glass. The whole village had turned up for her annual Christmas tea, an event as reliable as the post and twice as interesting. Mrs. Weatherby, an energetic widow with a fondness for organization, had arranged everything to perfection: lace tablecloths, polished silver spoons, and sandwiches so neat they could have been arranged by a ruler. It was to be a cheerful occasion, an afternoon of gossip and goodwill before the holiday bustle. But as fate would have it, cheer rarely lasted long in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple sat quietly near the far end of the garden, her knitting needles clicking softly, her pale blue eyes observing everything and everyone. She looked perfectly content, wrapped in a light grey shawl, her manner as mild as the tea she sipped. Yet beneath that gentle expression lay an alertness that could make even a magistrate fidget. The guests were many and varied. There was Colonel Fenton, retired and still fond of retelling his glory, days in India, his moustache quivering whenever he spoke. His wife, a thin, nervous woman who looked perpetually cold, kept glancing at her husband as if worried he might say something regrettable. Then there was young Alice Weatherby, Mrs. Weatherby's niece, newly returned from London after an abrupt end to what the village understood had been a promising engagement. Her laugh was forced, her eyes downcast. At another table sat Mr. and Mrs. Copley, the new couple who had recently bought the old Darnell place. They were polite enough, though no one seemed to know what, exactly, Mr. Copley did for a living. "Something in shipping," he'd said once, in a tone that suggested further inquiry would be unwelcome. It was all very ordinary, very pleasant, until the vicar's wife noticed something amiss. "Oh dear," she said suddenly, hand to her throat. "Isn't that Mr. Larchmont, under the holly tree?" Heads turned. And indeed there, beneath the largest holly tree near the end of the garden, lay Mr. Bernard Larchmont, sprawled in an unnatural heap. His tweed coat was dark at the shoulder, though whether from soil or something else, it was difficult to tell at first glance. Mrs. Weatherby gasped, clutching the edge of the table for support. "Good heavens! Bernard!" Colonel Fenton lumbered forward, his military instincts momentarily reawakened. "Stand back, everyone. Might be injured." But as he knelt, his gruff tone faltered. "No use. Poor chap's gone." A hush fell over the garden. The teacups trembled in a few unsteady hands. Mr. Larchmont was a man of middle years, precise in speech and manner, known for his cool, politeness, and unfailing punctuality. He had lived in the village only 3 years, and while none could call him exactly friendly, he was respected. He was also, most notably, the executor of the late Mr. Weatherby's estate, a role that had caused more quiet tension than Mrs. Weatherby ever admitted. Miss Marple rose slowly, folding her knitting with care. "Perhaps someone should fetch Inspector Craddock," she said mildly. "I believe he's stationed just beyond the High Street today, isn't he, Colonel?" The Colonel blinked, nodding stiffly. "Right, quite right, Miss Marple." While the others busied themselves with shock, speculation, and hushed whispers, Miss Marple's gaze wandered, not at the body, but at the surroundings. The holly tree's branches were thick and untidy, brushing low over the ground. There were footprints in the grass, pressed deep by hurried steps. 2 sets, one heavier, one lighter. The lighter steps circled back. She noted, too, that Mr. Larchmont's right glove was missing. His left lay near his side, stained with something dark. The police arrived within the hour. Inspector Craddock, a tall man with calm, sharp eyes, was soon examining the scene. "No sign of struggle," he murmured to his constable. "But there's a puncture wound, right near the shoulder. A blade of some sort." Mrs. Weatherby burst into tears, insisting that Mr. Larchmont had been like family, though most of St. Mary Mead knew that wasn't entirely true. There had been disagreements, something about unpaid shares, a disputed deed, whispers of impropriety in her late husband's accounts. The inspector questioned the guests briefly, taking notes as the light began to fade. "Anyone see him before the incident?" "I spoke with him not 10 minutes ago," said Alice Weatherby, her face pale. "He said he wished to speak privately about some papers." "What sort of papers?" "I don't know. He was rather insistent." "Did he seem agitated?" Alice hesitated. "No, not agitated, but nervous, perhaps." When the inspector turned toward Miss Marple, she smiled faintly, hands folded neatly on her lap. "I'm afraid I saw nothing of consequence, Inspector," she said softly. "Only that poor Mr. Larchmont seemed uneasy. One often notices when someone is not quite at rest within himself." Craddock gave a polite nod. "As always, Miss Marple, your observations are appreciated." The constable wrapped the body for removal, and the gathering dissolved into uneasy clusters of gossip. The teacups stood half full, the scones untouched. By the time dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, the holly tree stood alone again, its dark leaves stirring faintly in the cold wind. Yet beneath its shadow, Miss Marple's keen mind was already piecing together small, silent threads, an absent glove, a nervous niece, a widow's too loud lamentations. As she walked home under the soft glow of the lamplight, she murmured to herself, "People often hide behind the appearance of good manners. But the truth, my dear, always has a way of showing through the leaves." The bells of St. Mary's Church chimed softly in the distance, marking the hour. And somewhere beneath the holly tree, the quiet village of St. Mary Mead had already begun its descent into another of Miss Marple's mysteries. By the following morning, every corner of St. Mary Mead hummed with whispers. The death of Bernard Larchmont had spread faster than the winter frost. It seemed that not a single kettle in the village could be boiled without the subject arising, nor a shop bell ring without someone lowering their voice to discuss the dreadful business beneath the holly tree. At the post office, Mrs. Hartnell declared with authority that she had always suspected something peculiar about Mr. Larchmont. "He never joined the church fete committee, you know," she said, stamping her foot as if that alone proved guilt of some kind. "And that business with the council rates, late by a full fortnight, I'm told. Always a sign of disorderly habits." At the grocer's, Mrs. Price insisted that the murder was connected to romance. "Mark my words," she told the butcher. "There's a woman involved. There always is. And young Alice Weatherby was seen walking toward the garden right before tea was served. My sister swears it." Meanwhile, Colonel Fenton had taken to holding impromptu strategy meetings at the Crown and Anchor, the village's only public house. With a pint in hand and his voice rising above the low murmur of gossip, he speculated about burglars, foreign agents, and even a case of mistaken identity. "I've seen this sort of thing before," he said confidently to anyone who would listen. "Assassination in the colonies, clean strike to the shoulder, same pattern entirely." Miss Marple, however, sat quietly at her breakfast table in her neat little cottage on the edge of the village. The morning light fell through lace curtains, illuminating the delicate china and the small vase of winter jasmine beside her teapot. She listened to the faint sound of footsteps outside, the rustle of the newspaper being delivered, and allowed her mind to wander over the events of the day before. A man like Bernard Larchmont did not inspire affection, but neither did he inspire hatred, at least not of the dramatic sort that led to murder. Yet there had been something odd about his presence at that tea. His arrival had been late, his tone distracted, and that missing glove. Miss Marple had been quite sure it was nowhere near him when they found the body. She rose, wrapped herself in her pale blue cardigan, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The village was alive with chatter, yet as she walked, the conversation seemed to hush in her wake. Not out of disrespect, but rather from a kind of instinctive caution. Miss Marple had a way of making even the most enthusiastic gossip feel suddenly self-conscious. When she reached Mrs. Weatherby's house, the garden looked oddly empty. The holly tree stood as it had before, lovely and terrible, its berries gleaming like drops of blood against the green. The inspector had already been and gone, leaving behind a few trampled paths and a patch of turned earth where the body had lain. Mrs. Weatherby greeted her at the door, eyes red from crying. "Oh, Miss Marple, how dreadful it all is. I can hardly think straight." "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "none of us can after such a shock. Might I come in for a moment? I brought you a little marmalade. I always find it helps when the world feels unkind." Mrs. Weatherby gave a weak smile and ushered her inside. The drawing-room was untidy, teacups left from the previous day, and a faint trace of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. "I don't understand it," Mrs. Weatherby said, wringing her hands. "Why Bernard? Who could possibly want to hurt him? He was so proper." "Proper, yes," Miss Marple murmured, "though sometimes propriety can hide a good many things. You mentioned that he handled your late husband's affairs." Yes. Ever since Harold passed, Bernard has managed everything. The estate, the shares, even the insurance. He said I wasn't to trouble myself with the details." "And did you ever?" Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. "I tried once when Alice came home last spring, but Bernard said it would only confuse matters." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was sharp as a needle. "I see. And Miss Alice? How is she bearing up?" "She's upstairs resting. Poor child has been quite beside herself. She was so fond of Bernard, you know." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, in a tone that made fond sound like an intriguing word. Later that morning, Inspector Craddock made his rounds again, interviewing villagers and sorting through statements. He stopped briefly by Miss Marple's gate, his expression weary but curious. "I suppose you've already got your own thoughts on the matter," he said dryly. "Oh, just little things," Miss Marple replied modestly. "Human things. People often say too much when they're frightened, and far too little when they're guilty." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You think someone at the tea was involved?" "Well," she said, folding her hands, "it does seem rather unlikely that a stranger should choose that particular garden on that particular day to commit murder. Don't you agree?" He chuckled. "I should know better than to argue with you, Miss Marple. I'll keep you informed." After he left, Miss Marple sat by her garden gate, pretending to trim her roses while she watched the lane. At 11:30, she saw Alice Weatherby leave her aunt's house and hurry toward the post office, clutching a small envelope. Her steps were brisk, but uncertain, her eyes darting about. Not long after, Mr. Copley appeared from the opposite direction, tipping his hat toward the girl before she passed him without a word. He paused for only a moment, glancing after her, then continued toward the Crown and Anchor. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. It was all quite ordinary, except that Alice Weatherby was not known for morning errands, and Mr. Copley, as far as anyone could tell, rarely left his house before noon. By late afternoon, the village had formed its first theory, agreed upon over cups of tea and muttered confidences. The murder must have been about money. "It's always money," Mrs. Hartnell declared with finality. "Bernard Larchmont probably found something he shouldn't have in those papers." But Miss Marple was not so sure. Money was a motive, certainly, but it was too neat, too common. There had been fear in Alice Weatherby's eyes, not greed. And when people were afraid, it was rarely the pound note they feared most. As dusk fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat once more by her fire, a faint smile on her lips. "A pity," she murmured to herself, "that people don't realize how very revealing their silences can be." The holly tree shivered in the wind outside, as if listening. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck 6, and the village settled into uneasy darkness, unaware that beneath its calm facade, secrets were already beginning to stir. The following day dawned grey and heavy with mist, the kind that seemed to hang low over the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, like a secret the village didn't want to tell. The church bells tolled faintly through the fog, and the usual chatter of morning was subdued. No cheerful greetings, no laughter from the milkman. The shadow of Mr. Larchmont's death lingered, stretching long fingers over every tidy hedge and frosted window. Inspector Craddock arrived early, setting up a temporary office in Mrs. Weatherby's study, where the scent of rose potpourri clashed unpleasantly with the smell of damp wool and tobacco. His assistant, Constable Webb, was sorting through papers while the inspector paced slowly in front of the fire. "So far," Craddock said, "we've confirmation that Mr. Larchmont was stabbed with a sharp instrument, a knife or dagger, no longer than 6 inches. The coroner estimates the time of death between 4 and 5 o'clock, just before tea was served." Webb nodded, flipping through his notebook. "Guests all accounted for, sir, but no one saw or heard a thing." "Of course they didn't," Craddock murmured. "In a village like this, they see everything, except what matters." He paused as the door creaked open and Miss Marple entered, wrapped neatly in her pale pink shawl, a gentle smile upon her lips. "I do beg your pardon, Inspector," she said, "but Mrs. Weatherby thought you might appreciate some freshly baked scones. It's such trying work. Murder." Craddock accepted them with a faint chuckle. "You're too kind, Miss Marple, though I have a feeling you didn't come only to deliver baked goods." Her eyes twinkled. "Perhaps not entirely, but I do find that conversation, when properly buttered, yields the most satisfying results." Craddock leaned against the mantel, amused. "Well then, since you're here, what's your impression of our late Mr. Larchmont?" Miss Marple took a delicate seat near the fire, her hands folded. "A man of order, I think. The kind who keeps his shoes polished even when no one's looking, but also fearful of something. You can always tell when a man locks his front door twice, though he lives among friends." "Fearful? Of whom do you think?" "Oh, not fear of people exactly," she replied softly. "Fear of discovery. That kind of dread gives a person a curious stiffness, as though he might crack if spoken to too sharply." Craddock considered that. "Interesting. We've learned that he managed several estates, including the late Mr. Weatherby's. I suspect some financial irregularities might come to light soon." Miss Marple's expression was mild, but her voice held a hint of reflection. "Yes, money has a way of tangling itself around human hearts, but I don't think that was what frightened him most." She rose, brushing a thread from her skirt. "If I might offer a small thought, Inspector, you may find it useful to ask whether Mr. Larchmont had any private correspondence that went missing. It's curious, isn't it, that his right glove was never found?" Craddock straightened. "You think he was holding something?" "Or someone was," she said gently. "Do excuse me. I promised Mrs. Weatherby I'd see that Alice took her breakfast." As Miss Marple glided out, Craddock turned to his constable. "Search Larchmont's house again. Pay particular attention to his study. Letters, diaries, anything locked away." While the police busied themselves with the practicalities of death, Miss Marple made her way upstairs to Alice Weatherby's room. The young woman was sitting by the window, pale as the morning light, staring out over the frost-covered lawn. "Good morning, my dear," said Miss Marple kindly. "You've had a dreadful shock, I know, but a little breakfast does wonders truly." Alice turned, her eyes rimmed with red. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I can't seem to eat. Every time I close my eyes, I see him lying there." Miss Marple sat beside her. "You were fond of Mr. Larchmont, weren't you?" Alice hesitated. "I respected him. He was kind in his way." "In his way," Miss Marple echoed softly. "And yet yesterday you looked quite upset before the tea began. Did he say something to trouble you?" Alice's lips trembled. "He wanted me to come to London next week, to sign some papers on behalf of Aunt Clara. He said it was only a formality, but he wouldn't tell me what for. When I refused, he became, well, angry. He said I'd regret it. Miss Marple watched her quietly. Did anyone overhear? I don't think so. Oh, I wish I'd told Aunt Clara. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Sometimes, my dear, not telling is its own kind of confession. Downstairs, the vicar's wife had arrived with a basket of flowers and a burning desire to comfort through conversation. It's simply dreadful, she said to Mrs. Weatherby, loud enough for the hall to hear. To think such wickedness could happen right here, in your very garden, but then again, one never truly knows one's neighbours. Miss Marple caught the remark as she descended and offered a polite nod. That's quite true, Mrs. Davies, though sometimes one knows enough, just not what one expects to. By afternoon, Inspector Craddock had fresh information. Mr. Larchmont's house contained a small safe hidden behind a portrait. Inside were several bundles of letters, some official, some personal. One envelope in particular bore Alice Weatherby's name, though it was empty. Empty? Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully when Craddock told her. Yes, the contents were removed, recently, judging by the torn edge. She gave a slow nod. Ah, then perhaps it was not money after all. A letter can ruin a man more thoroughly than any debt. Do you think someone stole it before or after the murder? Oh, after, I should think, said Miss Marple, eyes far away. Guilt makes people clumsy, but fear makes them tidy. I expect our murderer is already putting things neatly away. That evening, Miss Marple attended evensong as usual, taking her place near the back pew. The choir sang softly, their voices rising through the cold air, but her mind wandered. She thought of Alice's trembling hands, of Mrs. Weatherby's tearful insistence that Bernard had been like family, and of the way Mr. Copley had lingered by the post office, watching. When the service ended, she stepped outside into the fog. The lamplight glowed faintly through the mist, and she could just make out the shape of someone standing by the church gate. It was Mr. Copley. He tipped his hat politely as she passed, but his eyes were guarded. Evening, Miss Marple. Strange times for such a quiet village. Yes, she replied mildly, though it's often the quietest places that keep the loudest secrets. His smile faltered slightly before he nodded and walked away. Miss Marple stood for a moment, listening to his fading footsteps. Then she murmured to herself, a liar, perhaps, but not the killer. Still, one can never tell. In my experience, people are like teapots. The cracks show only after the boiling. And with that gentle, chilling thought, she turned toward home, her knitting basket swinging lightly at her side, while behind her the church bell tolled the hour. Each note echoing like a reminder that time and truth were closing in on someone in St. Mary Mead. By the third morning after the murder, St. Mary Mead had reached that delicate balance between fascination and fear that always accompanies tragedy once the shock begins to settle. The newspapers had printed the story with lurid delight. Murder beneath the holly tree, respected villager found dead at Christmas gathering. And though the police had yet to name any suspects publicly, the villagers had already done so privately, and with great enthusiasm. Mark my words, Mrs. Hartnell said over the counter at the grocer's. It'll be that young Alice Weatherby. Pretty face, too many secrets. And that business with her broken engagement. No good ever comes of a woman jilted. Her audience, a group of matrons pretending to compare pudding recipes, nodded solemnly. The idea of a romantic tragedy soothed their imaginations. It was neater, more comprehensible than greed or deceit. Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock was seated once again in Mrs. Weatherby's study, his notepad open, his expression patient but determined. Across from him sat Alice herself, pale and fidgeting, her fingers twisting a handkerchief to shreds. Miss Marple, invited as a comforting presence, occupied a corner chair near the window, her knitting needles clicking softly in rhythm with the ticking of the mantel clock. Now, Miss Weatherby, said Craddock kindly but firmly. "We've learned from Mr. Larchmont's records that he wrote you several letters over the past month. Would you tell me what they concerned?" Alice's voice was small. "He said there were inconsistencies in Uncle Harold's accounts, that some of the estate's investments hadn't been properly recorded. He said he'd found something troubling and needed my signature to fix it." Craddock's pencil paused. "Did he say what exactly?" "No, only that he wanted to discuss it privately, before Aunt Clara became involved." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. "How considerate of him," she said softly. Alice gave her a pleading glance. "I didn't mean to hide anything, Miss Marple, but he frightened me that day in the garden. He said if I didn't help, he'd see that the Weatherby name was ruined. I told him I'd speak to Aunt Clara instead, and he walked away." Craddock leaned back. "And that was the last time you saw him alive?" "Yes." The inspector exchanged a glance with Miss Marple, who merely resumed her knitting. "Very well," he said finally. "You may go for now, Miss Weatherby, but please remain in the village." When she had gone, Craddock sighed and shut his notebook. "I don't like it," he muttered. "Too many gaps, and that empty letter in Larchmont's safe. It had her name on it. If she didn't take it, who did?" Miss Marple looked up, her expression thoughtful. "There's a saying, Inspector. Young people may panic, but old people plot. If Miss Alice took the letter, it was likely out of fear, but if someone else did, well, that's another story entirely." Craddock frowned. "You mean Mrs. Weatherby?" "I mean that a widow's tears often hide very practical considerations. She has depended on Mr. Larchmont these last years, yes, but dependence can turn to resentment when a woman feels managed rather than helped. And there's also the matter of those inconsistencies you mentioned." Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. "I'll have a look at her accounts." Outside, the village moved in its usual rhythm, milk carts rattling, children hurrying to school. But the air was different, charged with speculation. When Mrs. Weatherby appeared at church that afternoon, every eye followed her, noting her black gloves, her trembling hands. Miss Marple attended the same service, as she always did. When the final hymn ended, she approached the widow, her tone light and kind. "My dear, you're bearing up remarkably well. It's admirable." Mrs. Weatherby dabbed at her eyes. "I don't feel admirable, Miss Marple. I feel ashamed to think such wickedness should happen in my garden. I keep seeing him there, beneath that dreadful holly." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "I imagine that will stay with you. Death leaves rather stubborn footprints." Mrs. Weatherby looked startled. "Footprints?" "Oh, not literal ones," said Miss Marple with a small smile. "Although, of course, the police found quite a few. Some larger, some smaller. I dare say they've already noted which belong to you." The widow flushed. I stepped closer to help. It was instinct." "Of course," said Miss Marple mildly, but her eyes were far away. That evening, Colonel Fenton called at Miss Marple's cottage, stomping the frost from his boots and declaring, "Absolute nonsense, all this business about the Weatherbys. The girl's innocent, I tell you. No head for violence. If you want a real suspect, look to that Copley fellow." Miss Marple poured him tea, her face politely curious. "Oh? What makes you say so, Colonel?" "Character, my dear lady. He's got the look of a man who's seen trouble. And I heard from Jenkins at the post office that Copley received a telegram the very morning of the murder. From London. Jenkins says he went quite pale reading it." "How intriguing," said Miss Marple softly. "Do you happen to know what the telegram said?" The Colonel puffed up. "No, of course not. Jenkins didn't open it, just delivered it. But mark my words, there's something fishy, and his wife's been crying in the evenings. Jenkins' daughter saw her." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, emotion can be very telling, though tears may mean guilt, or merely fear of discovery. One mustn't rush to conclusions." The Colonel grunted. All the same, you keep your eye on that man." Later that night, Inspector Craddock stopped by to share his findings. "You were right, Miss Marple," he said grimly. "There's been some tampering with the Weatherby estate accounts. Larchmont transferred several sums to a private fund under his own name. Looks like embezzlement. But someone's gone through and destroyed most of the evidence. Cleanly done, too." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "And who would have known where those papers were kept?" Craddock sighed. "Only Mrs. Weatherby and Larchmont himself." "Then whoever killed him," said Miss Marple gently, "was very sure of what they were looking for, and of how much time they'd have before discovery." Outside, the wind stirred the holly branches against the window pane, their shadowy forms dancing like dark fingers in the lamplight. Craddock rubbed his temples. "At this rate, I'll have the entire village under suspicion. Copley, Mrs. Weatherby, her niece, even the Colonel's been acting strange, asking after the murder weapon." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It's always like that, Inspector. Everyone knows something, everyone hides something, and only one person has the dreadful luck of having done both." He chuckled wearily. "And you'll tell me which one, will you?" "Oh, not yet," she said, eyes bright with quiet amusement. "A good pudding must be steamed at its own pace." When the inspector left, Miss Marple sat alone before the fire, her knitting idle in her lap. Her gaze drifted to the holly sprig above her mantel. So festive, so innocent, yet so sharp to the touch. "Yes," she murmured to herself. "There are two kinds of murderers, the impulsive and the deliberate. But the deliberate ones, dear me, they always forget that small things have very long memories." Outside, the fog deepened again, cloaking St. Mary Mead in its shroud. Somewhere among its cobbled lanes and tidy gardens, the first suspect slept uneasily, unaware that Miss Marple's quiet eyes had already begun to narrow. The next morning brought with it a biting frost, the kind that painted the hedgerows white and made every footstep on the path crunch like the breaking of old secrets. St. Mary Mead stirred awake slowly, each cottage exhaling smoke from its chimney into the pale December air. But beneath the calm surface, the village was humming, softly, feverishly, with whispers of murder. Miss Marple, after a short breakfast of tea and a slice of toast, decided upon a little walk to the vicarage. She told her maid that the exercise was good for her joints, though in truth her purpose was not purely medicinal. There were small things troubling her mind, very small, the kind most would dismiss. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that evil often lurks in the details that polite society overlooks. At the vicarage, Reverend Clement greeted her with that mixture of affection and respect reserved for a woman whose wisdom had so often saved his sermons from moral disaster. "Ah, Miss Marple, you've come about poor Colonel Denham, I expect. Terrible business." "Indeed, Reverend. I do so wonder about the Colonel's last hours. It's curious, isn't it? He was so hearty a man, brisk in his walks, regular in his meals. Sudden death always seems so out of place in such a routine life." The Reverend nodded gravely. "Mrs. Price told me she saw him only that morning, arguing with young Alan Reeves about the parish fund. Said the Colonel was furious. Still, one doesn't die of temper alone." "No, indeed," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes on the frost-laced window. "But sometimes temper leads one into very unfortunate circumstances." The Reverend looked puzzled, but Miss Marple only smiled her mild little smile and asked after Mrs. Clement's dahlias before making her way back into the cold. Her next stop was the Green Man Inn, where rumor and truth so often mixed freely under the same roof. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of ale and coal smoke. Mr. Pritchard, the innkeeper, was wiping the counter with unnecessary vigor. He looked up as she entered, immediately flustered. "Ah, Miss Marple, haven't seen you in for a bit. Not that I'd expect you to, what with all this dreadful business." "I only wanted a cup of tea, Mr. Pritchard. It does one good on a cold morning." He obliged at once, clearly eager to talk. "You know, I always said that Denham fellow was asking for trouble. Too proud by half he was. Treated folks like we were beneath him. Still, I never thought he'd end up under the holly tree of all places. Miss Marple stirred her tea absently. Oh, but it is such a peculiar place, isn't it? So near the vicarage and visible from the lane. One would think a man intending to die, or to hide a body, might choose somewhere more discreet. Mr. Pritchard blinked. Hide a body? You mean? Miss Marple's smile was faint and quick. Oh, I do go on, don't I? Just an old woman's imagination. She sipped her tea and watched as a young maid hurried past, nearly dropping a tray of mugs. Miss Marple noticed her shoes. Scuffed, muddy, quite unlike the polished surfaces of the inn. The mud was red-brown, not the dark earth of the village paths. A small thing, perhaps, but Miss Marple's blue eyes sharpened slightly as she thanked Mr. Pritchard and took her leave. On her way back, she encountered Inspector Craddock by the church gate. He was speaking to Dr. Haynes, who looked distinctly irritated. I tell you, Inspector, the doctor was saying, the man didn't die of natural causes. The bruising around the neck is consistent with strangulation, and there's no doubt in my mind. Craddock sighed. So, we've got a murderer on our hands, and half the village seems to have a grudge against the fellow. Then you'll have your work cut out for you, Miss Marple said mildly as she approached. Craddock turned. Ah, Miss Marple, just the person I wanted to see. You've got a knack for these things. If you've noticed anything at all, unusual about the night of the party. Oh, my dear Inspector, I hardly think I notice much, she said modestly. Only that people do behave so very strangely when they think no one is observing. Why, even small gestures, a handkerchief dropped, a ribbon torn, can say quite a lot. Craddock frowned. A ribbon? Miss Marple smiled. Yes, Mrs. Denham's, for instance. I noticed at the party that her red velvet ribbon was missing by the end of the evening. I only recall it because it matched her brooch so prettily. And then, the next day, there it was, lying under the holly tree, half buried in frost. The inspector's eyes widened. Are you certain? As certain as one can be when one has lived as long as I have, she said serenely. I didn't wish to disturb it, of course. It might have been left there quite innocently, though I should think few ladies remove their adornments in a churchyard. Craddock made a note in his book and muttered, this could change things. Miss Marple inclined her head politely. Perhaps, though I should imagine the real change will come when we ask why it was there, rather than simply who dropped it. That evening, as the lamps of the village winked a light and the mist crept in from the fields, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting a pair of woolen mittens. Her hands moved steadily, but her mind was far from idle. She recalled the young maid's muddy shoes, the colonel's quarrel with Alan Reeves, and that bright red ribbon under the holly tree. Too vivid, too deliberate. A symbol, perhaps, or a warning. She thought also of Mrs. Denham's trembling hands at the party, the way her laughter had been a little too loud, her gaze always darting to her husband's face before she spoke. There was fear there, Miss Marple was certain. Fear, and something else. Relief, maybe, once the man had fallen. The old clock struck 9. Outside, the church bell echoed faintly through the mist, tolling the hour as if for the dead. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her eyes shining with quiet understanding. People so rarely change, she murmured to herself. But fear makes them act out of character. That's where the truth begins. She set her knitting aside, the faintest smile curling her lips. She had found her first true clue. Not the ribbon itself, nor the bruises on the colonel's neck, but fear and the strange tangled web it wove through every heart in St. Mary Mead. Tomorrow, she decided, would bring more answers, and perhaps, if one listened closely enough, the holly tree itself might whisper what it had seen beneath its frozen leaves. By the following afternoon, St. Mary Mead had shed its frost, but not its tension. The villagers went about their routines with strained politeness, each conversation a careful dance around the unspoken horror that had rooted itself in their midst. The holly tree in the churchyard, once a symbol of Christmas cheer, had become a silent sentinel of death, its crimson berries now a grim reminder of the blood that had been spilled nearby. Inspector Craddock had called a small meeting at the vicarage, intending to speak privately with those closest to Colonel Denham. Mrs. Denham arrived first, her complexion pale beneath a thick veil, hands clasping a handkerchief so tightly that her knuckles blanched. Alan Reeves followed shortly after, his expression a mix of irritation and fatigue, as though he resented being summoned at all. Then came Mrs. Price, fluttering and breathless, eager to offer assistance, or perhaps to ensure her own name was not mentioned too often in the inspector's notes. Miss Marple, of course, was already there, settled quietly by the window, her knitting needles glinting faintly in the winter light. She was ostensibly there at Mrs. Clement's invitation, though Craddock suspected she had her own reasons for attending. "Thank you all for coming," Craddock began, standing near the hearth. "I'll get straight to the point. Dr. Haynes has confirmed that Colonel Denham's death was no accident. He was strangled, most likely with a cord or a ribbon of some kind." Mrs. Denham gasped softly, pressing her handkerchief to her lips. Mrs. Price reached out to pat her shoulder with rehearsed sympathy. Alan Reeves, however, shifted uneasily, his jaw tightening. Craddock continued, "We found something near the scene. A red velvet ribbon. Mrs. Denham, I believe it may have belonged to you." The widow's eyes widened. "Mine? Oh no, Inspector, I don't think so. I mean, I did have one, but I lost it some days ago." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "How curious," she said in her gentle tone. "I could have sworn you were wearing it at the Christmas gathering. It matched your brooch quite perfectly." A silence fell. Mrs. Denham's lips trembled. Perhaps it fell off that night," she murmured, not meeting anyone's gaze. "Perhaps," said Craddock evenly. "But you understand the difficulty, madam. The ribbon could very well be the murder weapon." At that, the widow let out a small cry, and Mrs. Price rose at once. "Really, Inspector, must you press her so? The poor woman's been through enough." Craddock's eyes flicked toward her. "We must press, Mrs. Price. Murder leaves no room for comfort." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-loop. "I should think," she said softly, "that comfort is precisely what one must forgo when one wishes for truth. People often tell the truth only when it costs them their peace." Alan Reeves snorted. "That's all very poetic, Miss Marple, but what good is it? The Colonel was a brute, everyone knew it. He made enemies as easily as he made demands." "Enemies, perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but murderers are rarer creatures. It takes more than anger. It takes fear or desperation, and sometimes love in its darker form." Mrs. Denham made a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You can't possibly know what he was like behind closed doors." "Then help us understand," Craddock urged, his tone softening. "Whatever it is, Mrs. Denham, it may shed light on his death." There was a long pause. The crackle of the fire filled the silence. At last the widow spoke, her voice low and trembling. "He was cruel, not just to me, but to everyone who disappointed him. He'd humiliate me in front of guests, insult our staff, even threaten to withdraw money from the parish if the Reverend didn't speak as he liked. The night of the party, I wanted to leave him. I told him so. He laughed at me, said I'd never dare." Alan Reeves looked at her sharply. "You didn't mention that before." "I was ashamed," she said, tears now spilling freely. "Ashamed that I'd married such a man. But I didn't kill him, Inspector. I swear it." Craddock nodded slowly. "Very well. You'll forgive me if I still have to verify your movements that evening." Mrs. Price, never one to resist inserting herself into matters, leaned forward eagerly. "If I might add something, Inspector, I saw Mrs. Denham slip away from the gathering around 9:30. I thought she might have gone to fetch a shawl, but, well, now I'm not so sure. The widow turned on her with sudden vehemence. "You spiteful woman! You've never liked me." Now, Miss Marple interrupted mildly. "Let's not quarrel. We must remember that memory is a delicate thing. People often forget precisely when and where they saw someone, especially after excitement or a few glasses of sherry." Mrs. Price huffed. "I know what I saw." "Of course you do, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "Only it strikes me as interesting that you remember the time so precisely. You must have been looking at the clock. Most people don't unless they have a reason." A faint color rose in Mrs. Price's cheeks. "Well, I was expecting a visitor. My cousin from Bristol. He never arrived, as it happens." Alan Reeves gave a sharp laugh. "Your cousin from Bristol? That's a new one." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "It's funny how visitors sometimes appear or vanish depending on the tale one wishes to tell." The room went still. Craddock looked from one face to another, sensing that something important had just shifted beneath the surface. Mrs. Denham, pale and trembling, stood abruptly. "I can't bear this any longer. I need air." Craddock hesitated, but Miss Marple rose and said gently, "Perhaps I might accompany her, Inspector. Fresh air does wonders for the nerves." Outside, the sky had dimmed to a bruised grey. The two women walked slowly toward the churchyard, the holly tree stark against the fading light. "You're frightened, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "Not just of being accused, but of what the truth will mean once it's spoken aloud." Mrs. Denham's breath came in short, trembling bursts. "You don't understand, Miss Marple. I didn't kill him, but I know who did." Miss Marple's steps faltered. "Then why not tell the inspector?" "Because it would ruin someone. Someone who doesn't deserve it. He only meant to frighten him, not to—" She broke off suddenly, pressing a hand to her mouth. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. "My dear, one cannot protect the guilty forever. The truth always finds its way, even through lies woven out of love." A bell tolled in the distance. Mrs. Denham turned her face away, tears glimmering in the half-light. "He was only trying to protect me," she whispered. Miss Marple looked toward the holly tree, its berries glistening like drops of blood. "Yes," she murmured, "but protection, when born of guilt, often leads straight back to sin." As they turned to leave, Miss Marple caught sight of something gleaming near the roots of the tree, a tiny metal button, half buried in the soil. Not just any button, but one from a uniform jacket, Alan Reeves's jacket. She said nothing, only bent slightly as if adjusting her glove. But inwardly, her suspicions crystallized into certainty. The web was tightening, and before long, someone in St. Mary Mead would find that lies, like holly branches, had thorns sharp enough to draw blood. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to an unusual stillness. The frost had returned overnight, coating every roof and branch with a sparkling, deceptive serenity. Yet beneath the glittering quiet, the village's nerves were taut, as though everyone were awaiting a bell to signal some new calamity. And in truth, they would not wait long. At precisely 9 o'clock, a shrill scream shattered the calm. It came from the direction of the Green Man Inn. Windows rattled as doors swung open, and within moments a crowd had gathered, shivering in the cold. Miss Marple arrived with her usual quiet efficiency, moving through the throng without a word. Inside, the scene was immediately alarming. Alan Reeves lay sprawled across the inn floor, his face pale, eyes wide with shock, and a small pool of blood spreading beneath him. The innkeeper, Mr. Pritchard, hovered helplessly, wringing his hands. "It's a heart attack," he exclaimed, "or a fainting spell. No one touched him." But Miss Marple, crouching beside the young man, observed with keen eyes. She noticed the angle of his fall, the way his coat had shifted, and the faint indentations on the floor where his fingers had gripped the carpet. "Not a heart attack," she murmured, "and not a faint either." Inspector Craddock arrived moments later, brushing past the onlookers. He knelt examining Reeves with professional detachment. "He's alive," Craddock announced, "but barely. Someone intended to frighten him, or perhaps teach him a lesson. A blow to the back of the head could easily have killed him, and yet there are no signs of forced entry." Miss Marple, standing, folded her hands calmly. "Then he knows the attacker, Inspector. Someone he would allow near him." Craddock frowned. "Do you think it's related to the Colonel's death?" Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Oh, I think it is. Fear has a way of traveling faster than the frost." Reeves was assisted to a chair, his hands trembling uncontrollably. As the crowd murmured around him, Miss Marple leaned close. "You were frightened last night, weren't you, Mr. Reeves?" He nodded rapidly. "Yes, I received a note under my door. It said, 'We are watching.' I didn't know what to do." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And did anyone see who delivered this note?" "No, it was slipped in silently." She murmured. "And you keep nothing from the inspector?" He shook his head. I thought it might be nothing. I didn't want to cause a panic." "Of course," Miss Marple said softly. "People always underestimate the importance of small things, especially when those things seem trivial or out of place." Craddock examined the note, carefully unfolding the thin paper. Written in neat, precise handwriting were the words, "Some secrets are better left buried beneath the holly tree." A murmur ran through the crowd. Reeves paled. It knows." Miss Marple remained composed, her mind racing. The note confirmed her suspicions. Someone was manipulating events from the shadows, calculating each step with deliberate care. The attack on Reeves was meant as a warning, or perhaps a test. "Inspector," she said, turning to him, "we must reconsider our list of suspects. Whoever did this knows the village well, knows its routines, and understands the Colonel's connections intimately, and they are clever enough to provoke fear without leaving overt evidence." Craddock nodded slowly, rubbing his chin. "And our first suspect list may have been incomplete." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "It is often the case that the most dangerous people are those least suspected. They hide in plain sight, relying on the village's own assumptions to shield them." Meanwhile, Mrs. Price, who had managed to follow Miss Marple and Craddock into the inn, whispered conspiratorially to a nearby matron, "It must be Reeves himself. Think of the Colonel's accounts. If Reeves wanted to cover something up, this would be the perfect distraction." Miss Marple overheard, her eyes softening. "Ah, how quickly we assign guilt," she murmured to Craddock, "especially to the young or the convenient." Later, as Reeves rested under the watchful eye of Dr. Haynes, Miss Marple wandered the inn quietly. She inspected the floorboards near where he had fallen, noting the small scuff marks near the edge of the rug and a faint, nearly imperceptible smear of red mud. The same hue she had observed on the young maid's shoes days prior. A memory stirred. She recalled seeing the maid slip into the village at dawn, carrying a basket, her shoes gleaming in the frost light. The red mud, the neatness of her uniform, the careful attention to her movements. All signs, Miss Marple thought, of someone accustomed to being unnoticed, yet precise in timing. Then her gaze fell upon a chair, its legs scratched subtly as though moved hastily or dragged. Her mind worked in quiet rhythm, assembling fragments like pieces of a puzzle. "Someone wants to frighten him," she murmured to herself. "But not randomly. They have knowledge, confidence, and a motive connected to the Colonel's death, and someone else in the village may be assisting, or at least covering tracks." Craddock, returning to her side, asked, "Do you have a theory, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly. "A theory, yes. But a theory is fragile until tested, and testing requires patience. One must watch for reactions, notice what people hide, and observe when fear unmasks them." That evening she returned home and sat by the fire, the ribbons of flame reflecting in her keen blue eyes. She thought of the holly tree, of the hidden button, of the red mud smears, and of the terrified note slipped under Reeves's door. "Yes," she whispered softly, knitting needles moving once more. "The web is tighter than I thought, but webs, dear heart, are never perfect. Even the cleverest spider leaves traces." Outside, a winter wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the distant laughter of children unaware of the dangers lurking in their otherwise tranquil village. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone was watching, waiting, and fearing that the quiet old woman with the sharp eyes might already have begun to untangle their carefully laid deception. Miss Marple leaned back, her expression calm yet resolute. The next move would reveal much, and she intended to see it through with the patience of one who had spent a lifetime knowing that even the smallest of details could illuminate the darkest of truths. The following day dawned pale and overcast, the low winter sun struggling through a blanket of grey. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and after a modest breakfast of toast and tea, she set about preparing for what she privately termed the final test. She knew that a confrontation was necessary, though it need not be dramatic. One did not unmask a murderer with shouts or threats. No, it was far more effective to let the guilty reveal themselves through small, seemingly insignificant gestures. The twitch of a finger, a sudden stiffening of the posture, the avoidance of certain words or glances. Her plan was simple, yet delicate. The person she suspected most would be invited into a conversation that appeared entirely innocent. Miss Marple, with her habitual grace and mildness, would watch, listen, and wait for the telltale sign. By late morning, the opportunity presented itself. She had been walking toward the vicarage when she encountered Mrs. Price, bustling and officious as ever, carrying a basket of small cakes and a thermos of tea. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I thought I might take these over to the Clements. The poor vicar has been worried sick over the colonel's death. Such a terrible affair." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, adjusting her gloves, "and it is very kind of you. Perhaps you will join me in a walk? The frost has left the paths so slippery that company is always welcome." Mrs. Price agreed at once, apparently flattered by the invitation. They strolled toward the churchyard, speaking in soft tones. Miss Marple led the conversation carefully, interweaving innocent observations with subtle tests. "The holly tree has been so very conspicuous lately, don't you think?" she remarked lightly. "I often imagine it must watch over all our comings and goings, seeing everything yet saying nothing." Mrs. Price nodded, a faint shadow of unease crossing her features. "Yes, I suppose so. It is rather prominent. But one grows accustomed to trees, doesn't one?" "Trees are patient, my dear," Miss Marple said, her knitting needles now metaphorical, moving in her mind. "They wait quietly, yet notice every small disturbance in their branches. It is curious what one can overlook when one believes no one is watching." Mrs. Price's smile faltered. "Oh, I suppose so. We all miss things sometimes." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, and yet some things are very difficult to overlook. Tiny marks on the ground, faint smudges of mud, a ribbon lying where it should not be. Such things are easily dismissed, but the careful eye notices." Mrs. Price's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her gloves. "Ribbon," she echoed nervously. "Oh yes," said Miss Marple gently. "A red velvet ribbon, for instance, half hidden beneath the holly tree. It might be tempting to say it simply fell there, but the truth is rarely so convenient. I've often found that what seems accidental is deliberately placed to send a message, or to mislead." Mrs. Price's lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes flicked toward the holly tree, then back at Miss Marple. I don't understand," she stammered. "Perhaps you do," Miss Marple said softly. "Sometimes people understand very well but pretend they do not. It makes matters easier for everyone except the one they seek to deceive." Mrs. Price's steps slowed. Her face, which had been meticulously composed moments earlier, betrayed the smallest flicker of panic. Miss Marple noted it with quiet satisfaction. This was the kind of reaction that revealed much more than words ever could. They reached the foot of the holly tree, where the frost still clung stubbornly to the ground. Miss Marple pointed to the spot beneath the lowest branches. "Curious," she murmured. "One might think that a person could be very careful about where they place things, yet still leave traces behind. Mud on shoes, scuffs on the floor, faint fingerprints, all speak if one listens." Mrs. Price's composure cracked. Her shoulders trembled and she bit her lip, trying to maintain the mask of calm. Miss Marple, with the gentlest of voices, continued. "You see, my dear, it is a common human trait to underestimate small details. One believes that a gesture is unnoticed, a footprint overlooked, a ribbon ignored. But I've learned that every action leaves its mark, and every mark tells a story if one has patience to observe it." Mrs. Price's eyes darted nervously around the churchyard. "At last," she whispered, almost to herself, "he didn't mean to. I only wanted to frighten him, to protect her. It wasn't supposed to go so far." Miss Marple's knitting needles in her imagination clicked quietly, as if approving. "And there it is," she murmured. The truth, revealed not in a confession, but in the hesitation, the slip of the tongue, the quiver of fear. One cannot feign composure when guilt weighs heavily upon the heart. Mrs. Price turned toward her, face pale and drawn. You know." "I suspected, my dear," Miss Marple said, folding her hands. "Not only from your words and manner, but from the careful observation of small things. The red mud on your shoes, the way you avoided the Colonel's study, the note slipped under Mr. Reeves' door, all pieces of a puzzle that only the observant mind could assemble." Mrs. Price sank to a bench beneath the tree, burying her face in her hands. I didn't mean to kill anyone. I just wanted to frighten. I thought he would stop. I thought—" Miss Marple sat beside her, calm and unobtrusive. "Intent and outcome are often far apart in matters such as these, my dear. But it is important now to be truthful, so that justice may follow its proper course." From the corner of her eye, she noticed the village slowly gathering, drawn by the murmured words and the sight of Mrs. Price's distress. The time for quiet observation had passed. The truth was ready to surface fully. Miss Marple, as always, remained composed, her eyes reflecting the frost and the low winter sun. She had set the test, watched carefully, and the guilty had revealed themselves. Not through forced confession, but through the subtle, inescapable cues of human behavior. Yes, she thought quietly, the puzzle was almost complete. All that remained now was the final gathering, the explanation that would bring clarity to St. Mary Mead. And beneath the holly tree, the truth waited, as patient as ever. The following afternoon, the villagers of St. Mary Mead were gathered at the vicarage, their breath visible in the cold winter air and their faces drawn with apprehension. Word had spread quickly about the previous day's events. The near-fatal attack on Alan Reeves, the mysterious red ribbon and the subtle unraveling of a carefully maintained deception. A sense of anticipation clung to the crowd, like frost to the hedgerows. Miss Marple arrived quietly, as she always did, carrying her knitting and her calm, observant air. She had requested the villagers' presence under the pretense of assisting the inspector in reviewing the case. In truth, she was about to unveil the truth with the patience and precision only she could achieve. Inspector Craddock, standing near the hearth, cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. We are here to clarify the circumstances surrounding Colonel Denham's death. Miss Marple has kindly offered to provide her observations, which may assist us in understanding this unfortunate matter." Miss Marple nodded politely. "Thank you, Inspector. I shall speak only of what I have seen and of the small details that others might overlook. And in those small details, The truth is often found. She paused, glancing around the room. Her eyes lingered for just a moment on each person, noting their expressions, the way they shifted their weight, the tiny movements of their hands. Every twitch, every flicker of the eye, revealed a story. The Colonel's death was violent, though sudden. Yet violence is rarely random. It is directed, intentional, and often comes from someone who knows the victim intimately. Colonel Denham, it seems, made many enemies, but only one person acted in such a way that night to carry out what was ultimately fatal. A murmur ran through the room. Mrs. Denham clutched her handkerchief tightly. Alan Reeves sat stiffly in his chair, his hands folded on his lap. Mrs. Price, however, appeared outwardly composed, though Miss Marple noted the faint reddening at the edges of her eyes. Miss Marple continued. There were several clues that the police and the villagers have already observed. The red ribbon found beneath the holly tree, the faint mud smears near Mr. Reeves's residence, the scuffs on the floor at the Green Man Inn, and the note slipped under Mr. Reeves's door, warning of hidden secrets. She paused, letting the weight of these words sink in. Individually, each might seem trivial. Together, they form a pattern, and patterns are rarely coincidental. They are carefully arranged, with intent to mislead or to intimidate. Craddock shifted in his chair. Miss Marple, who are you suggesting did this? Miss Marple's eyes, bright and calm, met Mrs. Price's. It was you, my dear. Not merely because you were present, but because your actions betrayed your knowledge and your motives. You feared the Colonel, yes, but more than that, you wished to protect someone you cared for, or perhaps yourself, from his cruelty. Yet in doing so, you caused harm, perhaps more than you intended. Mrs. Price's hands flew to her face. No, I didn't mean... Miss Marple raised a gentle hand. Shh! There is no need for theatrics. I am merely stating what is evident to those who know where to look. The ribbon, your shoes, the note, and your subtle manipulations all pointed to you. The small mud stains on your shoes, the precise timing of your visit to the Green Man Inn, and the tremor in your voice yesterday. All these betrayals of innocence are as loud as a church bell to a careful observer. Alan Reeves, still pale, whispered, But why scare me? Mrs. Price's shoulders shook. I wanted him to stop, the Colonel. He was horrible. He humiliated Mrs. Denham, threatened the Reverend, and... Oh, I only wanted to frighten him so he'd leave her alone. I didn't mean anyone to die. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, soothing. Intent matters little when action has consequences. Your fear and desire to protect led to a chain of events culminating in the Colonel's death. It was not planned murder, but negligence and manipulation have grave results. Mrs. Denham, tears streaming, finally spoke. All this time I thought I was the one in danger. I didn't know who to trust. Thank you, Miss Marple, for seeing what no one else could. Craddock stepped forward, taking out his notebook. Mrs. Price, you will need to accompany me to provide your statement. The matter will be for the courts to decide. But I must commend Miss Marple. Her observations have provided clarity where evidence alone could not. Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. Thank you, Inspector. People often reveal more through their actions and small inconsistencies than through statements and alibis alone. The truth has a way of emerging, even when concealed by fear or cunning. Mrs. Price, now fully aware of her exposure, looked around the room. Her composure had vanished completely. I never intended for him to die, and yet he did, Miss Marple replied softly. And now the village may begin to heal, for clarity has been brought to what was hidden. The villagers murmured among themselves, a mixture of shock, relief, and apprehension. They realized that beneath the veneer of civility, each person held secrets, and that even small interventions could lead to unintended tragedy. Miss Marple looked toward the holly tree, visible through the vicarage windows. Its red berries gleamed faintly in the grey light, a silent witness to human frailty, fear, and error. She reflected quietly that in a village like St. Mary Mead, appearances were often deceiving, and kindness and cruelty could reside in the same heart. Craddock approached her. "Miss Marple, you never cease to amaze me. How did you know to suspect her?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, eyes softening. "Ah, Inspector, it is rarely about knowing. It is about observing. One sees the world as it truly is, not as one hopes it to be. And when small details align with the character of a person, the truth becomes undeniable." The villagers, now absorbing the full gravity of the events, began to disperse slowly, some whispering among themselves, others lingering near the fireplace, reluctant to return to their homes while the chill of the day still lingered. Miss Marple, left in quiet contemplation by the window, thought of the Colonel, of Mrs. Price, of Alan Reeves, and of the subtle, intricate dance of human nature that had led to tragedy. Her mind, ever observant, catalogued the lessons hidden in these events. Fear, secrecy, and the desire to protect could twist intentions into disaster, but with patience and attention, the patterns of behavior revealed everything. The holly tree, steadfast and silent, seemed almost to nod in agreement. Beneath its branches, truth had been uncovered, justice begun, and the web of deception unraveled, thread by careful thread, by the quiet, unassuming genius of Miss Jane Marple. The village of St. Mary Mead was quieter than usual in the days following the revelation. The news of Mrs. Price's role in Colonel Denham's death had spread swiftly, carried by whispers, curious glances, and the occasional blunt comment at the post office or the Green Man Inn. Life continued as it always did, yet with an undercurrent of unease. Even the most routine activities seemed tinged with a reminder of how fragile civility could be. Miss Marple, however, moved through the village with her usual composure. She greeted neighbors politely, exchanged pleasantries about the frost and the faint promise of spring, and attended to her daily errands as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet beneath her gentle exterior, her mind was busy, cataloguing every lesson learned from the events that had unfolded beneath the holly tree. Mrs. Denham was the first to return to a semblance of normality. She still wore a veil when leaving the house, and her eyes remained red from tears, but she went about her daily routines, visiting the vicar and assisting with charitable works as she had before. For her, the ordeal had been both a release and a burden, freedom from the Colonel's cruelty, yet a permanent awareness of the village's darker undercurrents. Alan Reeves, recovering slowly from the shock of his near attack, was quieter, more introspective. He had returned to his work at the village library, though his steps were measured and careful, and he often lingered near the windows, watching for signs of the unpredictable world outside. Occasionally he would pause, remembering the fear he had felt and the delicate calculations that had saved him from harm, or had perhaps simply delayed the inevitable. The villagers themselves adjusted in their own ways. Some busied themselves with preparations for the winter festivities, determined to restore cheer and normality. Others whispered in corners, speculating on motives, opportunities, and the hidden complexities that had been unveiled. Yet all were touched, in some subtle fashion, by the knowledge that appearances could be deceiving, that even familiar faces might conceal intentions unknown. Miss Marple visited the vicarage one afternoon, carrying a small basket of freshly baked scones. She found the Reverend in his study, surrounded by ledgers and parish correspondence, still attempting to reconcile his grief over the Colonel's death with his responsibilities to the community. "Good afternoon, Reverend," she said softly. "I thought you might like a cup of tea." The Reverend looked up, managing a faint smile. "Ah, Miss Marple, you are too kind. The village owes you much, though they may not all understand it. I confess I am still trying to comprehend how it all unfolded." Miss Marple sat, her knitting momentarily set aside. "It is often not comprehension that matters, Reverend, but reflection. People reveal themselves in subtle ways, and we can learn from observing those details." That is what I have been doing, quietly, as always." The Reverend nodded slowly. "And you were right. The clues were there, hidden in small things, ribbons, mud, even a simple note. It is astonishing how much one can discern if one only takes the time to notice." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed. And sometimes it is not the clues themselves, but the way people respond to them that tells the real story." As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple paused by the holly tree, now bare of snow, its branches stark against the pale winter sky. The red berries still clung stubbornly, a reminder of the events that had shaken the village. She touched one gently, her mind reflecting on human nature and the delicate interplay of fear, intention, and consequence. "People are curious creatures," she murmured to herself. "They are capable of kindness and cruelty, courage and fear, honesty and deception. And often, all of these qualities exist within the same heart, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in uneasy harmony." Later, she stopped by the Green Man Inn, where villagers gathered more cautiously now, their conversations tinged with both relief and lingering suspicion. The innkeeper, Mr. Pritchard, offered her a warm smile and a cup of tea, remarking on how the village seemed to settle back into its routines. "Settling," Miss Marple said softly, "but never quite the same. People carry the weight of what they have learned, and some perhaps carry the weight of guilt that is not their own." By evening, as she returned to her own home, the sky had taken on a deeper grey, the faint hint of snow falling in silent flurries. Miss Marple tended to her garden briefly, straightening a few holly branches and clearing away remnants of frost. She paused at the base of the tree, reflecting on how small details, the placement of a ribbon, the angle of a fall, the tremor in a voice, could shift lives irrevocably. Inside, her kettle whistled softly. She poured herself a cup of tea, sat in her favorite chair, and allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. The case was concluded, the culprit revealed, and yet the lessons lingered. Human nature, she thought, was both endlessly fascinating and perpetually mysterious. She glanced once more at the holly tree outside her window, its red berries catching the last light of day. Beneath its branches, the village's secrets had been laid bare, and in that revelation, life could cautiously resume. Yet Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface, hidden motives and unspoken fears would continue to shape St. Mary Mead, just as they had always done. And as the fire crackled in the hearth, and the wind whispered softly through the bare branches, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, contemplative smile. In the quiet observation of human nature, in the patient attention to detail, she had once again guided the village safely through a storm of deceit, fear, and unintended consequences. For Miss Marple, the world remained a delicate balance of appearances and truths, of kindness and cruelty, of human folly and insight. And in that balance, she found both her challenge and her quiet satisfaction. The following week in St. Mary Mead was unusually still. The village had resumed its daily rhythms, though the shadow of recent events lingered in subtle ways. Shopkeepers arranged their displays with meticulous care, as if to reassure themselves of order in the wake of disorder. Children played in the crisp air, their laughter carrying over hedgerows and frozen fields, unaware of the weight of the adult world that lay around them. Miss Marple, as ever, moved quietly among her neighbors. She visited the post office, where Mrs. Ferris commented on the remarkable calm that had returned. "I don't know how we could have survived the Colonel's death and all the fuss with poor Mrs. Price without you, Miss Marple," she said warmly. Miss Marple smiled, tucking a stray lock of silver hair behind her ear. "Survival, my dear, is often a matter of patience and observation. People reveal themselves if one takes the time to notice. That is all there is to it." Her reflections were not merely about observation, but about the subtle patterns that wove the fabric of the village, Each person carried a history, a motive, a secret fear, or a small kindness, and it was these threads that created the tapestry of daily life. Beneath the quiet streets and tidy cottages, the currents of human behavior flowed like an invisible stream, shaping events in ways the villagers scarcely suspected. The holly tree outside her window, now bare of frost but still adorned with persistent red berries, served as a reminder of the drama that had unfolded. Miss Marple often paused to study its stark branches, contemplating how the smallest of details, a note, a ribbon, a muddy footprint, had revealed truths far beyond their apparent significance. That morning, she took her customary walk through the village, noting familiar faces and subtle gestures. Mr. Pritchard, the innkeeper, arranged firewood with precise care, casting occasional glances toward the inn's entrance as though still expecting some disruption. Alan Reeves, recovering fully from his fright, quietly dusted books at the library window, his eyes occasionally lifting to observe passers-by with careful curiosity. Even Mrs. Denham, though still cautious, had resumed her charitable work, her hands busy with knitting and baking, as though reasserting her control over the small, ordinary world she loved. Miss Marple reflected on Mrs. Price, who had been taken into custody but remained under observation. It was clear to her that the woman had been motivated not by malice, but by fear and misplaced loyalty. Human nature, she thought, was rarely wholly good or wholly bad. It existed in a delicate balance, swayed by circumstance and emotion, and often revealed itself in unpredictable ways. She paused at the edge of the village green, watching the frost melt slowly under the weak winter sun. Even in St. Mary Mead's serene landscapes, life carried with it the potential for disruption. A careless word, an overlooked action, or a hidden resentment could ripple outward, touching everyone in its path. And yet, within this uncertainty, there was also resilience, a capacity for recovery, for reflection, and for quiet justice. Miss Marple returned home, settling once again in her favorite armchair by the fire. Her knitting lay across her lap, the needles moving rhythmically as she thought. The mystery had been solved, the danger addressed, yet her mind remained alert. In every smile, every glance, every whispered conversation, she detected traces of truth, motives, and intentions. Observation, she knew, was an unending practice. As dusk fell over St. Mary Mead, the cottages glowed with lamplight, the streets quiet but alive with the subtle pulse of human activity. Miss Marple drew her shawl tighter, listening to the distant calls of children returning from their afternoon play, the gentle rustling of leaves, and the occasional bark of a dog. Each sound, each movement, reminded her of the web of life in which she and the villagers existed, a web of kindness, fear, ambition, and secrecy. She allowed herself a small smile. Though danger had passed, she knew that human behavior was ever-changing, and that the village's peace was only as secure as its vigilance. Yet there was satisfaction in knowing that careful attention, patient listening, and thoughtful observation could prevent harm, uncover truth, and preserve order, even in the midst of chaos. Later, she sat by the window, a cup of tea warming her hands, and looked toward the holly tree once more. Its red berries, stark against the grey winter sky, seemed almost symbolic, a reminder of how even small, unassuming details could illuminate the darkest of human mysteries. "Yes," she murmured softly to herself, "one must always watch, always notice, and always consider what is left unsaid. In the quiet, in the ordinary, the truth waits patiently, and it is only through gentle observation that it is revealed." Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of frost and pine. The village, having endured fear and secrecy, now embraced calm, but the lessons of human nature lingered like a gentle echo. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, reflected on the delicate balance of human behavior, the thin line between intention and consequence, kindness and cruelty, innocence and guilt. In St. Mary Mead, life continued. And yet, beneath its ordinary surface, Miss Marple understood that every glance, every whisper, every small act could carry meaning beyond its apparent simplicity. And in that understanding lay the quiet power of observation, the subtle genius that had once again preserved the village, guided justice, and revealed the hidden truths beneath the holly tree. The fire crackled, shadows danced along the walls, and Miss Marple's blue eyes shone with the calm satisfaction of a mystery resolved, not with spectacle or force, but with quiet patience, insight, and an unwavering understanding of human nature. The village slept, but its truths, like the holly tree outside, stood firm, waiting for the next careful observer to notice what others might overlook. Winter had settled fully over St. Mary Mead, coating the village in frost and silence. The snow crunched beneath the careful footsteps of villagers who went about their routines with a new, cautious awareness. Life had returned to its familiar rhythms, yet the shadow of recent events lingered quietly in the corners of the streets and the minds of those who had witnessed fear, deception, and revelation firsthand. Miss Marple sat by her fire, the gentle warmth contrasting the chill outside. Her knitting moved in steady rhythm, the click of the needles a quiet accompaniment to her reflections. She thought of the colonel, whose arrogance and cruelty had set the stage for fear and miscalculation. Of Alan Reeves, whose brush with danger had left him more thoughtful, perhaps wiser. And of Mrs. Price, whose misguided intentions had led to chaos, demonstrating how easily fear and loyalty could be twisted into destructive actions. The smallest actions, Miss Marple murmured to herself, can alter lives irreversibly. Words, gestures, even the placement of a ribbon, they all speak if one listens carefully. And in a village such as this, with its interwoven histories and delicate social fabric, no deed exists in isolation. The villagers themselves were settling back into their routines, their conversations now more measured, their interactions tinged with the awareness that appearances could deceive. Shopkeepers greeted neighbors politely but with a subtle wariness. Children played with renewed joy, but a sharper attention to the world around them. And families, once oblivious to the invisible currents of fear and resentment, had learned that even the quietest moments could carry meaning. Miss Marple reflected on human nature with her usual quiet insight. She had observed, as always, the interplay of kindness and malice, courage and fear, innocence and deception. Each person carried contradictions, and often the most unassuming individuals could conceal motives that were neither obvious nor easily understood. It was this delicate complexity that made her work both challenging and endlessly fascinating. She thought of the holly tree outside her window, its red berries persistent against the gray winter sky. Beneath its branches, secrets had been uncovered, fear confronted, and justice, however tempered by circumstance, achieved. It served as a silent witness to the ways in which the ordinary could conceal the extraordinary, and the small could illuminate the great. Miss Marple sipped her tea and allowed herself a faint smile. There was satisfaction in resolution, in knowing that observation, patience, and a careful reading of human behavior had preserved the village from further tragedy. Yet she knew that the lessons of fear, misjudgment, and secrecy would linger, subtly influencing the hearts and minds of St. Mary Mead's inhabitants for some time. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the quiet echoes of past events and the promise of days yet to unfold. The villagers, while aware of the fragility of their peaceful existence, had also glimpsed the power of clarity and insight, how the patient attention of one perceptive mind could unravel confusion, expose truth, and restore balance. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire, her knitting now resting in her lap. She reflected quietly on the story of Colonel Denham, Mrs. Price, Alan Reeves, and the many small interconnected details that had made the mystery solvable. In a village as seemingly tranquil as St. Mary Mead, it was not the dramatic gestures that mattered, but the quiet observations, the small but telling inconsistencies, and the careful attention to human behavior. The day faded into evening, the village cloaked in the soft silver of twilight. Inside, the warmth of the fire spread gently through Miss Marple's home, a symbol of the stability and order that could be restored even after fear and deception had briefly disturbed the village's peace. She pondered the enduring truth of her own experience. That human nature, with all its contradictions and complexities, could be understood, anticipated, and guided, not by force, but by patient, empathetic observation. As night fell, the streets of St. Mary Mead lay quiet once more. Behind closed doors, families dined, whispered, and reflected on the lessons of recent days. Somewhere, children dreamed, unaware of the shadows that had passed through their village. And in her modest sitting room, Miss Marple, knitting in the flickering firelight, remained a steadfast observer of life's delicate tapestry, ever aware that the quiet mind often perceives more than the loudest voices. And so, beneath the holly tree, the village endured. The mystery had been solved. Justice, however tempered by circumstance, had been served, and life, in all its ordinary unpredictability, continued. Yet the lessons remained, quietly etched in the minds of those who had witnessed them, a reminder that vigilance, observation, and understanding were the true safeguards of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, serene and composed, leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself a brief sigh of satisfaction. Another mystery had been unraveled, another thread of human complexity illuminated, and another small corner of the world rendered a little safer by patience, insight, and gentle wisdom. In the quiet of her home, the fire glowing and the winter wind outside, she thought, the world was endlessly fascinating, and human nature infinitely revealing, and in that knowledge she found her quiet triumph.